Hello and welcome to the Empowered Curiosity podcast. I've got my dear friend Holly Toronto. She's been on the podcast before, and we've always stayed in connection, but specifically, I wanted to bring her on to talk about this like us versus them mentality that we're seeing in our world right now. And she has this beautiful three-part post on her Instagram page that I just got completely sucked into. And I think I want to start out, Holly, by asking you to catch our listeners up. I'll put the three posts in the show notes, but can you give us a bit of a bird's eye view of what that post meant for you, what you were trying to convey, and why this feels like such a potent topic right now?
Yes, and thank you for having me back. I'm so excited for this conversation today. So that post, it came off the back of me being interviewed on my friend Victoria Kleinsman's podcast, and she asked a series of rapid fire questions that I was totally unprepared for. She did not send them to me ahead of time. I had no idea what she was going to ask. And that in and of itself, that uncertainty is so nerve-wracking. But one of her questions was, if you could wave a magic wand and solve any world issue, what would that be and why? And I remember this moment, this internal moment I had of trying to find the right thing to say, like the righteous thing to say, which I'm sure we'll get into righteousness as we explore this conversation more in depth. And I was able to catch that and say, okay, this is not about having the right answer. This is about having the true answer, like the true answer for me. And what came through me in that moment was this recognition that if I could solve any world issue, it would be us versus them mentality. And that to me, and we're going to probably go so much more into depth in this, but it's deeply personal. It's very, very personal for me as someone who grew up in the evangelical church, where us versus them is the dominant narrative. It is us who have been redeemed and will be going to heaven, and it is them who are wrong and either must be saved or are going straight to the fiery pits of hell. And I have spent years, I guess since probably 2019, so the past like 3 years or so, really pulling apart and reckoning with my own contribution to us versus them mentality, how that showed up in my spiritual life, but then also how we do one thing is how we do everything. And how that translated into my political life and my social views and the way that I did my work and the way that I just showed up in life is having the sense of I'm in this camp and everyone else is in that camp, right? And this is like the statement of the decade, probably. Like 2020 was a very redefining year for me in so many ways. And I found my own us versus them mentality really, I could say, we could also call it my internal fragmentation, right? Really amplifying in that time of just so much uncertainty, so much collective trauma and fear. And it came to a point where significant relationships in my life were being harmed, where I was questioning, can I even have a relationship with this person who's extremely meaningful I've known most of my life? Or, should I be kicking that person out of my life? And it became this very like black and white, these people are good and these are bad. And it caused this fragmentation in my relationships. And I'm a big proponent of therapy. I go to talk therapy and I started to work through a lot of that stuff and really kind of bring it back to my, the origin point where I grew up. And then also just the humanness of us versus them mentality. Like we have this binary nervous system, which I know is something that you and our mutual friend, Lindsay Lockett, talk a lot about. We're always trying to find certainty. Oftentimes that's in our tribal association. So really bringing a lot of compassion and awareness to this part of myself, very long journey. And then through that awareness, committing to the practice of the gray, committing to the practice of nuance and what I'll often call the rehumanization of the other. So instead of taking this group of people who see things differently than me and putting them into this category of bad and other, right? And all of the labels that I could associate with them, is actually challenging myself to see them in their full humanity, to see someone who's different than me in their full humanity, and how that actually humanizes me too. Because in this pursuit of what I would say righteousness or goodness, there's this perfectionism that we also can uncover within ourselves, or recognize within ourselves as like a driving force of needing to put forward this perfect virtuous version of ourselves. And so really allowing for more nuance and complexity within myself, seeing that in other people, allowing that to create more mutual understanding and then harmony and healing in the relationship. And that to me is how we actually move forward. Like as utopian as it might sound, I really do feel like this is our collective human homework.
Yes.
Is like how we move beyond this like animal instinct to tribalize ourselves, right? And really come together towards finding that common ground and moving together in, for moving forward in the progress that I think we all want. So I think that answers your question.
I mean, there's so much to explore. I mean, we just dove straight in, which is one of the things that I love about you is we could just not speak for, months and months and months at a time. You and I just spoke last week so that we could record your podcast. But, the kind of trust that I think you and I have with each other is that we can go for months for not really speaking and we just dive straight in. And this conversation, I think, is something that needs to be had, and I couldn't think of a better person to have it with because of your upbringing and because of the work that you've done to dismantle all of that. And I think I want to understand how you define understanding versus agreeing. That's something that's been sort of bouncing around in my head these last couple months, and so I'd love to just hear your take on the differences and the similarities and the nuance between those two words and how you define them.
Yes. Okay. So I'm trying to think of like because there's definitely like some resources that I would love for people who are very interested in how they can start to be a part of the conversation around moving beyond us versus them mentality. And that when you ask the question, the difference between understanding and agreeing, what came to mind right away is a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And it's an exploration about why good people are divided over politics, religion, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And what I learned from reading that book, and along with a couple of other books, is that the opinions that we create, the moral judgments that each of us have, are not created based off of reasoning. Right? They're not created based off of like, we have done our research and this is the most reasonable, logical, moral conclusion, right? That it comes from a place of gut feeling. And because all of us as individuals are complex and nuanced and different. There's those of us who might lean more conservative. There's those of us that might lean more liberal. There's those of us that might have just different inclinations in general. Those gut feelings are going to be different based on that person's constitution, their personality type, right? And so when we're engaging in conversation and trying to find agreement, we're often after the wrong goal. right? The goal of trying to find mutual ground with someone that we might just be totally constitutionally, personality wise, different from. And the more we try to throw our facts and our figures and all of those things at the other person, the more they dig their feet in and they're like, nope, this is what and these are my facts and these are my figures. I think that might be something. I did a podcast about the us versus them post, and I talked about everyone having their own facts and figures, because we all do.
Yeah,
we all have our own. As much as there can be one information about this, like there can be complete opposite about that. And so when we approach a conversation from a place of, I need to get this person to agree with me, or we need to agree in order to have harmony in the relationship, we're setting ourselves up for failure in that relationship. Versus if we approach a conversation from a place of, okay, I already know that I'm not going to agree with you. And that for me to try to get you to agree with me is fruitless. But what I can do is calm my nervous system. Remember that your agreement with me doesn't actually contribute to my sense of safety, my sense of self, my okayness, right? And that it is actually okay for us to have difference and still belong with one another. And then from that place, approaching the conversation from a, you know what, I don't have to agree with you, but at least I can try to understand. At least I can ask you questions about how you got to that conclusion or why that's important to you. And what oftentimes ends up happening when we approach conversations from that place of understanding is that, well, a few things. One being, we find out we want the same thing. It's just that we have different ideas about how to get there, right? Or we find out about something about that person that really humanizes them and allows us to be like, wow, yeah, if that was my life experience, I'd probably feel the same way too. So it allows for just mutual understanding in that way, where it's like, I don't have to agree, but at least I can understand you.
And I think I want to preface that with, this is some deep soul level work that happens even before you have that conversation with that person who disagrees with you. And something I want to make really explicit in this is, to me, everything goes back to the nervous system. And your sympathetic nervous system is wired to protect you. And this is where the like us versus them thing actually feels safer in a sympathetically wired nervous system. Is if I can clearly define who my in-group is and who my out-group is, then I know who I can go to and find agreement. And agreement is oftentimes misunderstood, or I'm going to say misunderstood. It's often misunderstood as understanding. And when we are more in our parasympathetic, then that is the part of our nervous system that's wired for connection. And connection sees nuance. Connection has curiosity about the other person's story. Connection has a soul level sense of understanding and belonging, even if opinions and beliefs are different. And to me, that's the level of relationship that I am personally seeking in my life. Is now that I have, 2020 was just a complete reckoning for everybody, right? And it's in my life too, it's shaken some things up. And when I would try to do the thing, because I'm human too, of like, these are my facts, and this is why I'm making the choices that I'm making, and this is why I believe the things that I believe, I found that there was more of a fracturing there, just simply on the basis that both of our nervous systems are sympathetic, and that we are biologically incapable of connecting at that space. And so when I set my sights on safety, things changed because it meant that I had to take accountability and responsibility to step away from the argument when my sympathetic nervous system would get turned on, not because I needed to run away from what was happening in front of me, but because I needed to step away and regulate my own nervous system before I could come back to that conversation. You know, when I set my sights on safety, it made me think about, okay, so why does this person feel unsafe? And can I understand where that feeling of threat is coming from? And as you said, you know, that really humanized the people in my life that I had been having struggles and challenges with. And so I think that this concept of I understand you versus I agree with you is such an important one to set our sights on when we are in these potentially triggering, potentially fracturing conversations with the people that we love.
I so agree. And it's actually when we're able to approach a conversation from that lens where we don't actually need agreement, we just need understanding. It's actually a lot easier to navigate conversation because we don't have the impossible task of changing someone's mind.
Yeah.
People, and it's not to say that people won't change their mind. I've changed my mind a lot, a lot in these past couple of years, even before 2020, again, like with my religious programming and in so many other ways. But people don't generally change their mind in real time, right? Like it's not something that's happening in a conversation because, again, we are all fairly beholden to our facts and figures and our emotions and all of those things. And if we, I think that if we can create disagreement, conversations that are inherently coming from a place of disagreement, if we can create safety in those conversations and remove the judgment and, like not needing to change anybody's mind, that we can leave those conversations. And that's when the change actually happens, because me changing my mind oftentimes happened alone. Right. When I would be reflecting on that conversation and journaling about it and doing my own inner work, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm starting to see this differently. And then maybe I would listen to a podcast or I would find a post or somebody else that would inform me. Right. And then over time, that opinion started to change. And so I think in this world that we live in, again, we can talk about like how speed is something that we value. So we just want people to like get it like overnight, like change their opinions overnight, change their thoughts and all of that immediately. If we can slow down and have patience for people and know that when we approach them with love and understanding, they're much more likely to listen, right? We can actually create an environment for someone to change all on their own without us forcing them. And then also maybe they won't, right? Yeah. maybe they won't. Yeah. And at least that relationship can still have unity in it. Or again, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it is a relationship that needs to be, come to a conclusion, right? So there's no like right or wrong here, but I think patience with ourselves and with others is another really key component to navigating this deeply innate urge that we all have to us versus them, to tribalize.
Yeah. And I think that the piece there that really rang true for me is detaching without disassociating. And, anytime I go into, not even just conversations, but I set a plan for my business or I, plan a trip, whatever it is, anytime I have a strong sense of attachment to a particular outcome, like it needs to happen, I find that you don't see the scenery along the way. You don't see that there are off ramps and on ramps that you might want to take. And to me, the again, this is where the safety comes in, is if we can set our sights on safety versus having a particular outcome, which in this case, is I want to change this person's mind. I want them to agree with me. I want them to have the same exact thoughts and opinions as me. We don't actually have wiggle room for creativity. We don't have that space for the wisdom of the feminine to come in and hold us both in that sense of compassion and caring, so that we can shift our perspective, but come at it from a sense of safety and connection versus come at it from, protection and I need to, otherwise I won't belong. And that brings up, the strategies of fighting or fawning, which I'm seeing so much of since 2020. I'm sure it existed before then, but it's really come to light for me how deeply rooted this strategy of I will fawn and mold and shift and change myself to fit into the in-group that I have chosen, that it's honestly kind of hard to tell even what people's opinions are. Because as soon as you start trying to poke and I'm kind of cheeky that way of oh, so where does that thought process come from? And, and part of it is me just trying to understand. But it's when you haven't done that internal work to root in and have that opinion and thought tied to a belief system that is a core belief system of yours, it's hard having these conversations, because it's then it just remains surface level. It never gets any deeper than I just believe this way because this is what my in-group is telling me I need to believe. Instead, I want to start having conversations where it's okay, so can we get to the depth of the belief system so that we can really understand where that's coming from? And to me, I have so much more respect with the people in my life who have done that work, even if we disagree, even if we aren't in perfect alignment. The two people in my life that I feel like I most belong to and who understand me the most are my boyfriend, Sean, and my business partner and best friend, Andre. And with both of them, we disagree on so many things, but with both of those men, they've done the level of work so that they can actually tell me what core belief this is tied to, and then I can be oh, I can totally understand where that's coming from. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, so much. I'm just nodding along. There's so much about what you said, because it I think about this stuff a lot. In pregnancy, COVID, winter time, I have a lot of alone time right now. And I'm trying to soak up every second of it, because my baby girl is supposed to be here in 7 weeks. So I'm I'll, take up as much alone time and just thinking time as I can, because I have a feeling I won't be able to do this for a while. And so this is something I think about a lot. And what you were talking about in terms of how many of us, and myself included, might choose to take on certain opinions and beliefs because it's what our in-group believes. And oftentimes for me, that comes from a fawn response, right? When I do that, when I don't use my own self-inquiry to and critical thinking to sort of filter those beliefs and ask myself, hey, how does this land with me? Or how does this impact me? Or what do I actually think about this in the context of the greater good, not just even how it impacts me? It's usually coming from a fawn place, and there's dishonesty in it, right? So oftentimes there'll be dishonesty. What I'll feel in my body is I'm just kind of regurgitating what I'm supposed to say versus what maybe I haven't even figured out yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't even, like it's not feeling totally congruent. It's not that I have an opposite opinion, but there's just something that's sitting with me differently. But I don't give myself the spaciousness to actually explore that what feels incongruent, what's not feeling right in my body. And so I just like take it on, right? I just take on whatever I'm told to believe. And something came through for me the other day when I was walking and thinking about I was thinking, when I'm in relationship with others, I don't want to rely on their agreement. I want to trust in their honesty. I want to know that they're being honest with themselves and therefore me. That's like what safety is for me. If you're being honest with me, then I can feel safe. But if I just feel, or if I know that I'm just fawning for you and trying to say, yes, I agree with this, right? There's not actual real safety and belonging in that relationship, because it's dependent on one or both of us behaving or believing a certain way. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. And, you know, you and I had a thing come up fairly recently, and I'd love to just share a little bit of that, because I think that it illustrates this point perfectly. So all of my podcast guests gets a questionnaire of, you know, fairly, you know, the kind of questions that you would expect. Give me your short bio. What is your name? What are your socials? And one of the questions that I ask is, how do you identify gender-wise? And to me, that comes from my own medical background of like 99% of the people who I ask that question to, it's, you know, not a big deal and a no-brainer of where they fall along the gender spectrum. But for the like 1%, it matters a lot for them and helps create a sense of safety. And Holly returned the questionnaire and had declined to answer that question, and gave this beautiful explanation of why. And I thought that it would be such a good space to explore, you know, because I think that it demonstrated to me the level of work that you've done on that fawn response specifically. So I'd love to hear your side of the story, and you know, why you shared the thoughts that you shared with me in that email back.
Yeah. As you were reflecting, and thank you for opening the space for us to have this, what feels like a very, very difficult conversation. I think the conversation around gender and gender identity feels off limits, and it feels like that's just the general feeling that I get. It's just, there's not much room for questioning, and I understand. I understand
where very like right or wrong. Yeah. Yes.
There's like, you're in this camp or you're in this camp. And, and so I have not talked about any opinions or anything publicly, mostly because I'm still working through a lot, like as I had said before. Yes. And in hearing your reflection back on our own, and I wouldn't call it us versus them, but like my own being honest with you about why I didn't answer a question. I like was thinking about it, I'm like, God, it would have been so much easier if I just did. Right? Like it would have just been so much easier if I had just answered it. Like we wouldn't have to have a difficult conversation. I wouldn't have to, what I felt, risk you, Kat, seeing me in a different way, or like losing your respect. I know that was something that I brought in my response to you, is like I'm really worried about losing your respect as a colleague, as a friend, as someone that I've gotten to know. And I remember sitting in front of, but then bringing it back to like this deep value that I have around honesty with myself first, and then bringing that into my relationships. As I sat in front of the questionnaire, I was like, I got to do it. I have to listen to myself here. And so, and you know, when we talked about us sharing this on the podcast, we decided that this conversation is not about me sharing my views on gender ideology or gender identity. It's really not.
At all. Yeah.
It's more sharing where I'm coming from. So, so I declined to share what my pronouns were, right? And there has been this, I would say, expectation. I don't, that's the word that's kind of coming through right now, that pronouns go in your bio and they go in your signature and they go here and there. And we talk about being like cis or trans. And for me, I decided, after having grown up in an environment where I needed to constantly regurgitate things that I wasn't quite sure were my truth, right? I wasn't quite sure landed with me. Like, for instance, that someone who is gay is going to hell, right? Like, that was something that I was taught to believe and to proselytize about, right? Or that there were sinners and there was good people, or that I was born inherently bad, or that sex before marriage was a sin. Like, these beliefs and these certain ways of being that I had no choice but to believe and regurgitate and talk, and, like, you know, in conversations with community, be like, yes, that's totally what I think. I've made this agreement with myself that before I take on a new, I would say, language or a new way of talking about myself or other people, that I would really do the self-inquiry first, that I would really look inward first and just see, like, hey, how is this landing with me? How does it feel for me to share, to put forward that information about myself, versus just being like, yes, okay, I will do that. Hook, line, and sinker. And to me, it's not about denying anybody the right to identify the way that they do, right? Like, I fully, as somebody who leans, like, as somebody who leans towards freedom of speech and freedom of expression as, like, a core value, like, abso-freaking-lutely, like, identify, express yourself fully, right? And in that, if that's going to be true for everyone else, it has to be true for me too, right?
Yes.
So and I'm sure that decision to identify differently didn't come lightly, right, for other people. So for me, it's not something that I'm going to do, like, just willy-nilly, right? And I think another really perfect example of this too, and why it's also important, is I was working on a project with a colleague, and it was like a webinar or something like that, and she wrote the copy for the webinar, and she put in the webinar the spelling of woman, which is WOMXN. And that was how she chose to, and we had to have a really difficult conversation. Not difficult necessarily. It was similar to, like, mine and your conversation, where I was just like, hey, I'm not sure how I feel about changing the spelling. I'm just not sure. It's just not landing with me. And then sure enough, like, a couple weeks later, it's like culturally, like, now that word is actually really exclusive, right? It says that trans women are not women, right? If we have to put the X in the and so, like, there's already been a cultural change around that, right? And so really allowing ourselves, I mean, there's so many examples. There's the black square, right? Like, there's so many ways in which when we don't check in with ourselves first before doing something, that we might act out of integrity and thus create disconnection with ourselves and with others. And so that's sort of the space that I'm coming from, is not from a place of wanting to disregard anybody's identity, right? But really also anchor into my own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I have to say that, like, you wanting to have that conversation with me instead of doubling down on your fawn response and being like, this would have been, it would have been so much easier. I wouldn't have, like, questioned it at all had you just put your pronouns in. And, like, I respect you so much more just because of the honesty that you were able to bring into that conversation. And I would hope that if you bring that energy into other conversations with other people, that they would also feel that same level of respect, even if, you know, and I'm sort of in the same thought process as you, is just because you say yes to sharing your pronouns, like that doesn't necessarily, like to me, it's like it's not cutting out other people's capacity to say no, or vice versa, you know, and so my work centers around you get to have autonomy in how you live your life. And that autonomy comes from actually, you know, we talked in depth about the feminine and masculine dynamics on your podcast, but I think that it comes from you sinking into the wisdom and intentions and integrity of the feminine. And then that's where the aligned action comes from. And I think when I scan the horizon of the collective right now, there's a lot of masculine action and unbalanced masculine action, meaning people haven't had, even, we're not afforded the opportunity to slow down and check in with the feminine unless you're actually carving that space out for yourself. Because of the way the news cycles work nowadays, because of the way social media works nowadays, it's so like go, 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 and you have to have an opinion and you have to put your, you know, thoughts out immediately after things have happened. You know, there's a lot of performance in terms of action, and it's specifically because we haven't had a chance to process from that feminine space, which is about stillness and space and time. And so to me, when you came back with your email, you know, sort of explaining what you just shared now, what that indicated to me was you are somebody who's exploring this feminine side because you have lived your life in this action-oriented, move before you think sort of masculine space. And I think that that's where our, at least on my side, my respect for your intentions deepened even more. And again, this is where we find that true sense of belonging. You know, I don't need to agree with you. You don't need to put forth your pronouns if that doesn't feel in alignment with you. But when there's an understanding, and you know, I feel like you understood my side of it too, of like my own background and why I put that question in the questionnaire. And to me, that does come from integrity. And that's where I feel like that true belonging happens, is when we can both understand and not necessarily agree. And we have autonomy in choosing how we participate.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that I remember like writing that email and like feeling like what I know of you, what I knew your response would be. Like that it would be as gentle and compassionate as it was. But I remember leaving that and like going to my husband and just being like, I just did something. I'm like, I'm afraid of what like she's gonna think of me. Like I'm like, and him just being like, it's all right, it's all right. And like, and then in your response, feeling that safety, like feeling that like, okay, I feel very seen by this person. I feel very respected and acknowledged. And then also like being given the gift of a different perspective that helps inform mine as I sit in that seat of exploration, right? Like, okay, this is where this does feel appropriate for in some instances. And so it's allowing my perspective to broaden. Like that's the gift that you gave me, but both of us have sat in this really difficult work of not being reactionary to what our nervous systems are telling us is like a very unsafe situation, or responding to what Africa Brooke, I think do you know who Africa Brooke is? She's
I don't think so.
she's not an influencer. She's very clear she's not an influencer, but she's like a beautiful coach and consultant who talks a lot about this kind of stuff online. I can send you her profile, but that she talks about what she calls the mob in your mind. That's it. So Africa Brooke calls this the mob in your mind. So I could have very well been in reaction to what I would imagine that a version of you that doesn't exist might have said to me, right? Like a version of you that might have been like, you're a turf bigot, right? Like that's the fear that so many of us have in taking the spaciousness to sit and form our opinion or to allow ourselves to be different in how we view something, is that we're constantly trying to avoid these labels of you are this, so therefore you are bad. Right. And what's been so interesting to me as someone who grew up with this fundamental core belief of I was born bad, like that original sin is the foundation of Western Christianity, right? You were born bad and need redemption. But it's been really interesting for me to see that crosses religious boundaries, right? Like that fear of being seen as bad or immoral or on the wrong side of history, that it goes beyond religion. And that's something that I'm in my infancy thinking about, like, where does that come from? It does feel more gendered to me than not. Like I find that in my female relationships, that wanting to be seen as good and wanting to be seen as having the right opinions, it seems to be much more of a value than in my relationships with men. But again, I'm not like, this is not fully formed thoughts, but all that to say that you gave me such a positive reinforcement in trusting myself to be honest with myself and therefore others by the way that you responded to me.
Yeah. I think it's also important to name, I'm grateful that is what came up for you, and, that I was able to instill a sense of safety and like positively reinforce that. I think it's also important to name that even if I had come back and the relationship had become fractured and, I was unwilling to see things from your perspective, that big, brave work of naming what was happening in your system and communicating that you needed to sit in your own sense of integrity before you answered a question like this, that still needed to happen regardless. And this sort of circles back to an earlier part of the conversation where it's like, regardless of the outcome, it's still worth doing this work of checking in with the self, and, it all worked out beautifully for us. And, to me, it's something that instilled more trust in the relationship. But we can't simply be brave when we know exactly what the outcome is going to be. It's being brave in these moments where it's like, you don't know, and you have to do it anyway because it is honoring yourself, and because it is honoring your integrity, and because it is honoring who you are. And again, I think that shifts us away from that fawn response, because if you're just doing things to, make things comfortable for the other person or make the relationship better, then that's not really secure ground to stand on, because again, you're not being honest. I would much rather have difficult, honest conversations with the people I love rather than having dishonest but agreeing conversations.
I am so glad that you named that piece, because it's like, I was very fortunate that I feel very fortunate that the outcome of that conversation, and it did feel like such a gift. And I will say, again, this is something that I've been practicing. Like I am a student of this as much as you know, I'm ready to talk about it publicly. And there have been other relationships that have ended because of seeing things differently. And that's a painful, really painful experience, one that I still feel like I'm healing from like a specific situation that happened last year. And it's also, I think, in trusting, gosh, like in trusting that when we create honesty in these relationships, if the relationship crumbles, if the relationships fracture, that it wasn't a relationship that was meant for us to begin with, right? On both ends, that we can do everything that we can to find harmony in the relationship. And if it crumbles as a result of you being your full self, me being my full self, then that's the price that we pay for integrity.
Yeah. And to me, having done this work, it's kind of a scary thing to say, but like my integrity and honesty to self has to come before any relationship. Because then if we prioritize the relationship over your own integrity, then like, what are you even standing on? That's just shifting sand, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly it.
So much yumminess. I'm doing this new thing on the podcast this season, and I have 3 questions that I want to ask all of my guests, because I think that there's so much that can be uncovered in just sort of like having a bit of structure. And actually I was inspired by you, because you ask one question on every single podcast, and my questions are actually very similar to yours, just because they resonated so deeply. So thank you for the inspiration.
Yay, I love that they are, because I've never answered my own questions before, so,
yeah.
or like similar versions of them. So yay.
Yeah. So the first question, which is the one that's very similar to the one that you ask on your show, is how have you had to fragment yourself to survive? And I think that we got quite a bit of that, but how would you answer that? You know, just.
So I think what we've been pulling apart throughout this entire conversation is really the root of my fragmentation is in all of the ways in which I needed to comply in order to be on the receiving end of love and safety and belonging, which is the definition of fragmentation. And it all comes back to, my spiritual upbringing. But I can happily share like more examples of ways in which I've fragmented myself, in order to feel safe and to belong. And I would say we pulled this apart a little bit on my podcast, but and I've talked very candidly about my relationship to productivity and the masculine, and how I have historically really valued or learned to value myself, and did value myself based on my output, based on how much I was doing, how much I was earning. And this really became apparent for me when I worked in fashion, when I was in the corporate world. And I was so validated for how hard I worked and how much people in my life, like, you know, bosses and senior executives would just acknowledge, God, Holly is such a hard worker. And it's just like, give me more of that, right? give me, to the point of genuine illness, right? Like I was sick constantly. And so there was like the fragmentation that would happen in my body, but also fragmentation that would happen in my sense of who I am. Like what are my contributions, my worth, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I left my corporate job like to actually get away from that because I felt really overworked. But when you don't do the work on
Mm-hmm.
yourself, because I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna start my own business and like work less, right? But like I
Yeah.
brought that paradigm.
Same pattern. Yeah.
It's yes, it's trading one fundamentalism for the other, which is something that I've
Mm-hmm.
recognized in my Christianity deconstruction. And so it's taken me a very long time to get to this place. I would say probably 5 years of my career to get to this place of really learning to value not just my output, right? Like what I'm actually creating or the money that I'm making, but the impact
Mm-hmm.
that I'm making.
Mm-hmm.
And calling back my feminine, right? So like I got the
Yeah.
masculine structure, I got the masculine hard work down, but leaning into the feminine, receiving rest, stillness, right, has
Mm-hmm.
been
Mm-hmm.
a work in progress for me, and one that I would say that now that I'm doing the work, I feel more aligned with the fullness, the
Mm-hmm.
wholeness of who I am as both
Yeah.
a masculine and feminine being, because we all are, than
Yeah.
ever before.
Yeah. Which leads me, because the core of the work that I'm trying to inspire in people is this sense of Tao, this sense of purpose, and how the wounding, and what I'm hearing in your story is there was this wounding around the masculine being a bit of an overperformer and telling the feminine to take a seat back and you're not important and everyone gives me all the validation and no one thinks you're worthy. And so
Mm.
I'm curious about how this very specific wounding of yours has led to a more Tao driven, purposeful life, sitting on this side of it.
Oh my God, I love this question so much. Oh, so I mean, I would say that it's led to this next chapter of my life in motherhood opening up, like what's
Mm.
feeling really purposeful to me right now. And this is probably like a whole other topic one day. um, is leaning into being like essentially a full-time mother. Like that's the plan. I'm still going to see clients, but like predominantly I'm going to be the primary caregiver for my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels incredibly purposeful to me right now. It feels
Mm.
incredibly aligned,
Mm-hmm.
and also like, who am I that I am doing this? Because it's a total departure from a previous version of me that actually
Mm-hmm.
couldn't imagine, that actually resisted having children because
Mm-hmm.
of what I thought it would do to how I valued myself as, you know, boss babe, right? Climbing the ladder
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, being seen as like this empire building woman, which is like a beautiful thing. And it's a part of me. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a part of me. But when I leaned too heavily into that, I fractured this other very nurturing side of me that actually really wants to take care of my child as of today, right? Like that, I remain open to that changing. Of course, I'm always going to take care of my child, but like whether or not that always looks like essentially full-time motherhood or not, I'm not like attached, right? But
Mm-hmm.
when I really allowed myself to start to play with the masculine feminine balance within myself and lean more into my feminine and like intentionally, so like intentionally
Mm-hmm.
taking time away from working and practicing being in the feminine, because it feels like at first it felt like walking on stilts, like like walking on like shoes that are too small, right? Like it just didn't feel like
Yeah.
it was very uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
But the more that I allowed my capacity to be in the feminine to amplify, the more I got access to this part of me that really truly desires this right now. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels like such a gift. It feels like such a gift to be able to say yes to that and to see what that brings about in my relationship with this little being that I don't know yet.
I mean, I think that's so beautiful because leaning into your feminine has given space for this new expression of your life. And I also think about, for me, the work that you do, the work that I do, like, has such potency to change the next generation. And that's a lot of the reason why I feel compelled to keep doing this work, is because through my clients, I want them to feel integrated and whole, so that if the young people that they're interacting with get to, reap the fruits of this work that we do. And what I'm hearing in your story is this little girl is going to have a very, very different mother than who you would have been able to show up as 3-4 years ago. And, not just, I don't want to call it like, how lucky is she, because it's not luck. It's a lot of work to have come to this place where you're not resisting the feminine, and you're allowing her to take up space and to have a voice in this, and to have, intentionality in the way that you live your life.
Yes, I think, thank you for saying that. And I often will hear from my clients who have been working on themselves or, investing in themselves, that they feel like it's selfish in some way, that they are selfish or indulgent for spending as much time and energy and money on working on themselves as they are. And what I always guide them back to is, oh, can you remember how you doing that work on yourself shifted your relationship with that person, right? And how that person got to have like you and that person have a deeper connection, or how that allowed you to blossom into the service work that you want to do. And you see how it's actually creating this ripple effect, that it's, I think Glennon Doyle says this, I believe there's no such thing as one-sided liberation, right? The more we set ourselves free, the more we give others permission to do the same. And so, to me, as we work on ourselves, I use this in a lot of the body image work that I do, that it's legacy work, right? We're changing what's for many of us been generations of one way, right? Or generations of trauma, or generations of fragmentation. And we're choosing to change that for existing relationships in our life and for future generations. And so it's okay to be selfish and do the work on yourself, and just know that it never actually stops with you.
That's beautiful. I just love chatting with you.
Likewise, my friend. Likewise.
One day we'll have to do it in real life. I don't know when that's going to be, but I want to give you an actual hug in person.
It's always so fun to me to see the people that, and it's been a while since something like this has happened, or even just Julie, like my business partner, like she and I had met in person before, like working together. But anytime we'd see each other in person after, I'm like, I forget that you have like the rest of your torso and legs. Like I forget that you're not just like a floating head on a screen. And like, I love, like, I need more 3D, 4D experiences in my life with the people that I've connected so beautifully with over the internet. Like, I just want to know them and like see the rest of their bodies, and see like the wholeness of who they are. So
agreed.
We'll make that happen one day.
Yes. One day it's going to happen. So can you please share with our lovely listeners where people can find you, and where you share your thoughts, and go for it.
Yeah, I would say that the place to go right now, would be my podcast, which is Return to Wholeness, and Kat is a 2-time guest on Return to Wholeness. So there's some really good episodes there. We've been around for about a year now. And Kat was our first guest ever.
Yay!
So I would say that's the place to go, because when I go on maternity leave, I do have bi-weekly episodes that are scheduled, which are actually interviews of me that I've done on other people's podcasts. And that's where content will be more consistently. I am on Instagram. I'm extraordinarily inconsistent because I don't like it. I don't like Instagram. It feels like a necessary evil for right now. And like, I'll go through phases where I post a lot and then I don't. So it's a little inconsistent, but you can certainly follow me there, holly.toronto. And then, yeah, of course, my website is just hollytoronto.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being you and for bringing your heart and having this big, brave conversation with me.
Thank you for creating the space.